So thank you for joining us for this session talking about pulses and how they can save the world, or perhaps a little more modestly, how they can help us solve some of the challenges facing the global food system. And on a more human scale, we're going to be hearing some inspiring stories about particular pulses from the people who have worked to revive and promote those wonderful seeds. So I'm Nick Saltmarsh, and just to very briefly introduce myself, I'm one of the co-founders of Hodmedods, which is a Suffolk business that works with a network of farmers supporting diverse agroecological production to provide a range of pulse, grain and seed whole foods. And we're very much all about diversity, both in the field and on our plates. I thought it'd be first worth asking, what are pulses anyway? There's often a lot of confusion about exactly what a pulse is and the names for pulses, beans, peas, and so on. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization succinctly defines pulses as the edible seeds of leguminous plants. And this includes beans, chickpeas, lentils, peas, as well as numerous other lesser known species that comprise between them thousands and thousands of different varieties. And for more than 10,000 years, pulses have been among the world's most important foods. Since the start of Neolithic farming in the Fertile Crescent, they've been grown and eaten hand in hand with cereals. The pulses contributing essential fertility to the fields, as well as nutrition to the people that grew them. Now, I find when talking about pulses and their benefits, it's hard not to come across as madly evangelical, because there just simply is so much that is amazing about pulses, spanning nature, nurture, culture, and flavor. So firstly, pulses are good for nature. They're an incredibly low impact food, especially when compared with alternative animal sources of protein. They require less land, less water, and less or even no artificial fertilizer at all, thanks to the amazing property of leguminous plants to take nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil as fertility with a little help from their microbial friends. They also help to build soil structure, boost soil health, and contribute to soil biodiversity. But pulses also nurture us as people. They provide, as well as protein, the other main macronutrient that they provide is fiber, as well as resistant starch. These perhaps the macronutrients most missing from our diets in Britain. And they provide many micronutrients as well, including iron, potassium, and folate. They're also full of energy, but they have a very low glycemic index, and so they help avoid the blood sugar spikes that can contribute to the development of type 2 diabetes. And then there's flavor. Pulses also taste fantastic, and for this reason, they're grown by communities across the world. I read recently that pulses or leguminous crops are grown in 173 different countries, which just led me to wonder which 20 or so countries aren't growing them. And this, across the world, comprises a rich cultural tapestry of varieties grown, dishes cooked, festivals celebrated, traditions followed, and legends told. But don't just take my word for the wonder of pulses. In 2016, the United Nations designated the International Year of Pulses in order to raise the profile of these leguminous seeds and to promote them and encourage more growing and consumption of pulses. They then designated the 10th of February annually as World Pulses Day in celebration of pulses. And there are many global campaigns. Beans is How is just one of the more recent global campaigns that seeks to promote pulses and encourage us to grow and eat more of them. And that campaign, which was launched at COP27 last year, seeks to double pulse consumption across the world by 2028. But for all this, pulses have been in decline over recent decades and even recent centuries. As countries around the world have industrialized, their diets have shifted away from pulses as a main source of protein to meat and dairy. And sadly, the UK has led the way in this shift. We Britons are perhaps the nation most estranged from our historic pulse crops. And we urgently need to eat more pulses, but we also need to celebrate, consume, and support the vast diversity of pulse species, types, and varieties. Slow Food's Arc of Taste catalogues 300 threatened types and varieties of legume around the world, but this is just a fraction of the full span of diversity. Just up the road from us, here at the Bean Store in Suffolk, the John Innes Centre collection in Norwich has a collection of more than 4,000 different types of pea. But if you look to the International Centre for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas in the Lebanon, they have a collection of over 10,000 different lentils. And at the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics in India, there are 17,000 different chickpeas in their collection. So we have this extraordinary diversity, but it is fragile, and we can't rely on crop institutes to preserve these and keep these varieties alive. This extraordinary diversity is in danger of being lost if we don't eat more pulses and eat more variety of pulses. Thankfully, the tide is turning. There's a rediscovery of pulse culture around the world, a global movement of local community initiatives, reviving, growing and promoting pulses. From the alb lentils of Swabia in Germany that Dan Saladino described in his book, Eating to Extinction, to the renegade Montana farmers growing different lentil varieties, as described in Liz Carlisle's book, Lentil Underground, which has lent its name to this session. And I'm joined today, this afternoon, by three people who can really illustrate this movement through their stories of work to save and promote particular pulses in their parts of the world. So first, we're going to turn to a different part of Europe for inspiration and illumination. And I'd like to introduce Thomas Erlandsson. He's one of the founders of Swedish pulse pioneers Nordisk Revivara. And since 2016, they've worked with a network of Swedish farmers to, as they put it, gently cultivate a range of both traditional and new legume and other arable crops. They've revised Gotland lentils, widely grown across Sweden's largest island up to the end of the 19th century, and, forgive my Swedish pronunciation, Rättvixät, which wonderfully translates as a righteous pea, grown in the country of Dalarna since the 16th century. But Thomas can tell this story best. So I'll now hand over to Thomas to tell the story of Nordisk Revivara and the pulses they work with.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for having me. It's an honor and privilege to be here. I will give you a little insight to what we are trying to accomplish here in Sweden. And Nick, you already introduced our little company, and I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Nordisk Revivara. That's a hard word for for non-Swedish speakers, I know. We are very convinced that we should grow more of what we eat. And when I say we, I speak in national terms in Sweden, and also grow that in a way that improves soil health. And having that as an ambition, diversity really becomes a key word for us. And I will share a picture with you that I hope illustrates this in a good way. Do you see the presentation?
Yep.
Did you see it full screen? Great. So this is a selection of our assortment. And we have several lentils and several peas and lupins and beans and so some other special crops like quinoa and things like that. And we often get the questions, why not work with just a few of these varieties that are really popular and so on. But diversity is so important for us in especially two ways. And everything we grow is ecological, and we are looking beyond ecological primary production. We try to find and develop nurturing methods that improves the soil health, that makes the soil more productive, that lowers the need for inputs, and also make the plant and thus the food healthier. So our farmer network, we have around 35 farms today that we work with, are really interested in implementing these practices and move from a degenerative farming to a more nurturing one. And the diversity of plants and root systems in our crop rotations and intercropping techniques is the key to be successful with this. So that's why that's one reason to do this. The other reason is that the diversity in our assortments is also key to help our clients to make healthy and tasty food. And especially as we start to produce more plant-based products based on legumes and pulses. The assortment is a key to find natural features of these crops that can be used in the product development. I would like to highlight, so just like Nick said, looking back at the Middle Ages and forward, some of Sweden's most important staple food and survival crops have been pulses, primarily peas and broad beans. And they've been used for both animal feed and food, human consumption food. The Rättvik pea gives us a really interesting perspective on this, because it's native to a little village up in Dalarna, which is quite high up in latitude in Sweden, called Rättvik. And the Rättvik pea is a little small pea with a very intense taste and sweet nutty tones. And as a human food, it was used as flour in buns and breads, and also in porridges and soups. And what's remarkable with this is that it has an outstanding quality in its amino acid profile. It has a very high content of the essential amino acids compared to other peas in general, actually. And Carl von Linné, when he was traveling around the world and also in Sweden, he actually noted this specifically, that this pea from this little local place was really fantastic when it came to survival and health aspects.
Thomas, sorry,
yes.
Can I just ask you, I think you should maybe move on your slide, and they're not actually displaying full screen. We can just see the your whole desktop.
You do. I'm really sorry. So if I do like,
you can now see the slide,
this,
but it's still not full screen.
Is it not full screen now?
No. I mean, I think we can manage as it is, but yeah, no, you've moved the slide on now.
But okay, I maybe should stop sharing.
I think it is fine as it is. We can see the slide.
So you could see the slide even though you see the other ones as
we
well.
See the slide, just we see the rest of PowerPoint.
Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit of information there. It's just interesting to see.
That's fine. Carry on.
Yeah, and see how it's intercropped here with oats up in Dalarna. And our story, we got a hold. This Rättvik pea actually survived in gardens in this region, because these are very long plants, and growing and harvesting them was done by hand. But when the industrial farming took over, the first machines really couldn't handle all the green material and the big plants. And about the same time as this was happening in Sweden, also got a little bit wealthier, and we could start to import food. So old peas and beans quickly got outdated and too expensive to work with, actually. And cereals and fodder beans took over in crop rotations. So the large-scale businesses started to be implemented, and they were more lucrative, and we could start importing things. And that's when these kind of beans disappeared and peas. But this one survived in gardens because of its food quality, and we got a hold of about 2 kilos uncleaned peas in 2000, some 10 years ago, something like that. And we started to multiply that, and we could, a few years after, we could start harvesting this pea with modern machines for the first time in history, actually, which is fairly amazing. So we're really happy to have this on the market now. The next crop I would like to show to you is the Gotland lentil. And lentils has never been a really big crop in Sweden for natural reasons. We haven't really, on this latitude, we haven't had cultivars that have adapted to the conditions. But this one, out on this island in the Baltic Sea, it has adapted over hundreds of years. It came sometime in the early Middle Ages. It came to Gotland through trade, and it was put in. It was intercropped usually as strengthening animal feed, but also for human consumption, eating dry or in flours and pancakes and so on. And this has developed and adapted and has a very interesting taste profile, also very rich in taste because it grows for a very long time. Since we plant it early, it's kind of a cold climate on this island with many sun hours. So, and also the limestone rich soils is really giving a certain quality and profile to this lentils. And lentils is really growing in popularity here in Sweden right now. So we try to promote this as the shining star that could add great value also to the modern Swedish food culture. So that's two examples of pulses from our heritage.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Thomas. It's really inspiring to see the pulses that you're growing across the North Sea in Sweden, and to compare them with what we're working on here, just the other side of the North Sea in East Anglia in England. So we will, if time allows, come back with some questions at the end of the session. But first of all, we'll move on and hear the other stories from our other panelists. And I'm very excited to introduce Dr. William Thomas. If we may call you Doc Bill, I gather that's how you're often known. Dr. Thomas is a pathologist by trade, but he's played a key role in promoting the Sapelo Island red pea, along with other traditional crops of the area. And the amazing history of this pea, also known as the Geechee Red pea, is also related by Dan in his book, Eating to Extinction, telling the story of how Cornelia Walker-Bailey in particular ensured its survival. But again, this story is far better told by Doc Bill than by me. So Bill, if I can hand over to you, please tell us the story of the Sapelo Island red pea.
Oh, gladly. It's a pleasure to be here to do that. Is there any way to share any pictures or not? Is that possible?
I think if you share, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there should be an option to share screen, and you should then be able to show us pictures or slides.
Okay. Or share content.
Share. If you move, you may need to move your cursor to the bottom of the screen, and then you see.
Yeah, I see that here.
In the middle is share screen.
Okay. And okay, let me pick a few pictures from that.
So we can't yet see your screen.
Right, I'm picking a few pictures from it.
Yeah, sure. And then when you're ready to go, if you just click on share screen, we should see your pictures and hear your story.
Almost there.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us. We're
very
excited to have you with us.
For having me on here and telling a little bit about the story of Sapelo Island. Okay. Hit add. Okay. Okay,
brilliant. We can see the picture.
Okay, this is Cornelia Bailey Walker. She's probably the most famous person from Sapelo Island. She passed several years ago, and she's the one that's done the most to bring and hold the pea from Sapelo Island and bring it to the world. Right now, she's actually putting up a poll. When I talked to her about a few weeks ago with one of the local restaurant guys who wanted to get some of the peas to use, and her and some of the residents on the island actually constructed a small area where they were putting up fence posts to grow the pea, because Sapelo is a barrier island. It's about the size of Manhattan, and it has about 35 residents on it, and a lot of wildlife. It's almost like a state reserve park. So when you grow peas, you have to put them up. You have to do some fence protection, because not only do you have to worry about deer, they also have to worry about wild cows, which are on the island. And so here's her actually helping with the others, putting up a fence for to protect the peas. The classic way peas are eaten on the island are two ways. The red pea, the Sapelo Island red pea, is a pea or Geechee pea that's grown throughout the Barrier Islands. It's grown on Sapelo Island, grown on Sea Island. It's also grown on the islands of South Carolina, Edisto Island, those islands. What made Sapelo unique is the fact that you only get to the island by ferry. So that particular pea had nothing really done to it for a few hundred years. And it was a very intense red. The most common variety of the Geechee pea was the Sea Island pea, which was grown by at Anson Mills with Glenn Roberts. Same crop. It's just that this crop here, the people just planted the red pea. When the peas would come in different colors, red, clay, but they only replanted the red ones. And since they only traded with themselves, you had this crop pretty much being the same throughout the period. Here's showing one of the shells with the peas in it and opening it up and seeing the few peas in it. The plant, when it grows, is an old variety. So they don't all happen at once. You get peas over a series of time, which makes it hard for mechanization to occur. So when people plant the peas, they pick them. And if you want to do any mechanization, you have to look at the crop and determine at what point can I go and gain the most of it, and knowing that you're going to lose a fair amount of them in that processing. But the peas to be taken, grown to a certain point, cut down, let to dry. And then once they dry well, then you can come in with a cultivator and harvest some of the peas that way. But the most classic way it's done, people go and they pick the peas as they appear and are ripened on the vine. These are done by small farms, and not only just on the coast, on the islands, but also on the coast as well. Here's one of the locals that we use, Sapelo Island Geechee Red peas. And it was a project that was started with Cornelia Bailey, myself, people on the island, Glenn Roberts, and Chef Lentil Hopkins out of Atlanta. He was one of the prime drivers to try to give a fair price, because these peas price range anywhere from 25 cents a pound to $4 a pound. But Lentil put a floor rate at $9, which made it profitable for farmers to do this, and also made it easier for them to go and earn a living, or at least grow enough to make it worth their while to grow the peas. Here's a crop of the peas here. You can see they're pretty much uniform, pretty much dark red. They have a nice, strong outer cavity. It's really resistant. It keeps its crunch even after it's been cooked for a fair amount of time. And the classic accompaniment to this was rice, and the rice at this time was Carolina gold rice. So the peas and rice gave you all the protein you needed. The peas were done either two ways. They were either eaten fresh or they were dried. The advantage of drying a legume is you have that long storage aspect of it. We would usually take the peas, dry them, get a drying reading in it to know that we are pretty uniform, so you have to worry about fungal infections occurring in the pea. And pea was quite delicious with that. Here you can see a group of the peas right here now growing. And again, you have some that are forming with the flowers, and you have different stages. So you would have to look at a crop of this and determine at what point is it maximized if you want to do mechanical harvesting. But a lot of times, particularly for the projects we did, it was done by hand. Here's a farm we had on the mainland called Georgia Coastal Gourmet Farms, as they have with Sapelo Island. And again, the pea work was done by hand. The rice, and that's roughly a little story of, I guess I can get rid of the picture, I guess.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Bill. That's really given us well, sadly not a true flavor to taste, but given us a flavor of the story of the red pea. And yeah, it is mouth-watering seeing that the rice and peas, that's the traditional dish cooked with those. I will just, our largely British audience may be surprised by the appearance of the red peas growing in the field and the shape of the peas. They are in fact different species from what we in Britain call peas. Your red peas, I understand, are a type of cowpea, which is from the Guinea family of legumes. So although they're called peas, they are in fact very different from what we over this side of the Atlantic typically think of as peas. So you are still sharing your screen. So I think if you can click again to, yeah, brilliant. Now we're back to the group of us. Thanks ever so much, Bill. Again, I hope we'll have time to come back with some questions, but first of all, I'll move on to our third panelist, who is in fact my colleague, Josiah Meldrum, one of my co-founders here at Hodmedod. I briefly introduced what we do at Hodmedod. And Josiah's going to tell us more about how we started 10 years ago and some of the crops we work with, perhaps in particular the Carlin pea and the fava bean. But I'll leave him to tell our story and also show us his slides. He's got some high technology slides to illustrate his talk. Thanks, Josiah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. That's brilliant. And I think Nick would agree with me that maybe 15 years ago, we would never have imagined that we'd be on a panel like this, eulogizing about pulses, about beans and peas and lentils and chickpeas. But we had a real kind of Damascene moment in 2008, 2009, when we genuinely realized that pulses were the answer to so many questions, as Nick has already described. We were working for a small regional non-governmental organization called East Anglia Food Link, which had engaged with a community group in Norwich who wanted to know whether the city, which has got about 160,000 people, could feed itself. And if it did that, how would diets and how would land use critically need to change in order for that to happen? A really interesting thought experiment, which led us to this, what now seems an unsurprising conclusion, but came out of the blue in lots of respects, which is that pulse crops and leguminous crops, so those crops that aren't harvested for the dried seeds, would be critical in a revised rotation that produced more protein from plants and produced nitrogen naturally synthesized from the atmosphere with that fantastic symbiotic relationship that pulses get involved in. And when we began asking that question and thinking about how practically we could implement a change that would see more pulses grown and eaten, we looked at what was already happening in the UK. And we began to very quickly realize that because the UK industrialized so early, we had completely lost the connection with some of those older ways of eating and the older crops for growing. So for example, there is a fava bean, which is it's in the same species as the broad bean. For UK listeners and for people in Europe are probably familiar with that, but it's a small seeded bean for drying. And historically, and for about 2,000 years in the UK, that had been a staple. It had been the store of protein, it had been the store of nutrition more broadly, and a critical source of food through the winter when we couldn't keep livestock because they were expensive and we didn't have the technologies to produce dairy products that we could store. And when we industrialized and got richer and more to the point, wanted to eat higher status foods, we abandoned the fava bean in favor of more meat and more dairy. And it completely disappeared from the written record. It completely disappeared from our recipe books. And when we approached farmers to talk about getting people to eat fava beans in the UK, they were at once appalled and amazed that we would be taking what they thought of as animal food and feeding it to people in Norwich. And then we came across some farmers who told us about growing beans to fit in with Ramadan. And this was a really fascinating kind of new angle that we picked up on the beans, and that they were being exported to North Africa and the Middle East, where they were still really widely eaten for human consumption. There hadn't been that process of cultural shift and industrial and economic change that saw the beans stigmatized as poor people's food. And we realized there was this rich global heritage of recipes for these beans that we didn't eat in the UK. And having initially carried out this thought experiment for the Norwich Community Group, asking whether Norwich could feed itself, we began to realize that we needed to reacquaint people with this crop. We packed it up very simply in a little cardboard box with a recipe booklet. We explained to people how they could cook it and how they could eat it, you know, from falafel to stews to soups. And of course, in Europe, where the New World beans, as we call them in a rather Eurocentric way, the Phaseolus beans, French beans, cannellini beans, kidney beans that came from the Americas, they completely replaced fava beans in our diet. But a lot of those traditional dishes from all across Europe would originally have been made using these dried fava beans. So we began with the humble bean and reacquainting people. It's not a crop that's disappeared, but it's a crop that has disappeared from our plates. And I think that kind of diversity in our diets is really important. Having started with that crop, we quickly realized that there was a whole rotation that needed changing, and that a positive change could occur through the inclusion of pulse crops that fix nitrogen, bring that nutritional benefit, and bring soil health and that nurturing approach to agriculture that Thomas was talking about so brilliantly earlier on. And I remembered at that point going to Preston in my late teens, in fact, to go and buy records from a particularly good record shop when I was living in Lancaster. I didn't have very much money. And for lunch, we'd go to the Flag Market or Preston Market and buy a cone of parched peas. And at the time, that seemed quite normal. And then, but 20 years later, I realized how unusual and unlikely that was. And the Flag Market stall in Preston was one of the last places selling parched peas. And parched peas were these dark brown peas in a vinegary, salty, peppery sauce, and you'd eat them just with your fingers, or you'd add them to some potatoes, and they were absolutely delicious. When we began looking into growing more pulse crops, we realized they were what are called carlin peas or maple peas. And they're very different. They're much closer to the medieval relatives of peas that would have been very widely grown in the UK before the blue and yellow colored, or green peas and yellow peas became much more common. And those seed coats, which are really beautiful, as you can probably see if I zoom in using my slide, are full of micronutrients, anthocyanins. They are full of tannins, which are actually really good for us, and they're really good for you know, everything from sort of properties that help ward off cancer and diseases to things that stimulate our microbiome into action, which Tim Spector was talking about earlier. And they're also beautiful in the field, and the farmers that we work with, and we also work with a network of about 35 farmers, really love working with these older, unimproved peas. Often they need to be grown as poly or bicrops, so they'll be grown with a cereal like triticale or with barley, which supports them and which they offer then fertility that doesn't need to be added to the crop in the form of synthetic nitrogen. And then we take those crops, take those peas and offer them to people. And with the carlin peas, but also with the fava beans, one of the things that we quickly realized was that these were completely unfamiliar foods. These were not things people were eating. And we needed to create a whole new story, a whole new narrative about eating these pulse crops. And historically, I think they'd always been seen as a rather hair shirt 1970s whole food, you know, food stuff in the UK, and have been, again, still rather stigmatized. But in the UK, our food culture has radically transformed, even in the last 15 or 20 years. We're much more interested in global cuisine, particularly from North Africa, from the Middle East. And these pulse crops are really widely used. And the carlin pea, for an example, traditionally eaten very simply, parched and served with fat bacon and a bitter green like sorrel, actually makes a brilliant chickpea substitute. So we began to tell that story and find ways of working with them in that way. And looking back at the historic record and understanding how they've been grown previously, where they fitted into rotations. And I think there's a sort of feeling that we're discovering a whole new way of growing food through agroecological processes that work in sympathy with nature. But actually, traditionally, that's how these crops would have been grown anyway. They would have been grown as maslins, which is a Middle English word for a mixture. And a maslin is a mix of a pulse and a cereal crop, which would have been harvested together and probably would have been milled together and eaten together in breads or drunk in beers. And we began to look at some of these approaches to bicropping and polycropping. And at the same time as interrogating that historic record and realizing what had been lost in the UK, we discovered that lentils were grown, much like in Scotland. Lentils were also grown in the UK, even right the way up to the Northern Isles in Scotland. They were a subsistence crop. They didn't feature very heavily in recipe books or in trading records because they fed people in their homes and they were used for animal feed, but they were grown. And so we too have begun cultivating lentils. And we've looked at some of the North American and Central and South American beans as well, the Phaseolus group of beans. They're much harder to grow in the UK. And I think the realization we've come to is that they are delicious and interesting and beautiful, but that peas are our beans in the UK, and that huge diversity in the Norwich seed bank, the thousands and thousands of accessions that are not grown on farms. We should be doing more work to investigate those, find out how they grow in those traditional systems, and ask a question that is very, very rarely asked of seed banks, which is, what does that taste like? I think that's all I'm going to say, because we're tight for time. It'd be great to take some of the questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Josiah. And yeah, great question to end on. What does it taste like? Because that is, of course, fundamentally, you know, a crucial element of pulses, that they do generally taste fantastic, and you know, for all their environmental and health and nutrition benefits, at the end of the day, they're just, you know, fantastic and great to eat as well. So I think perhaps prompted by a desire to taste some of the pulses we've been hearing about, there's a couple of questions coming in about growing these different pulses, particularly in the UK. I think most of our audience is from the UK. So yeah, I'd like to put that to all of our panel, really. If you can tell us how suited the pulses you've been talking about are to growing on a domestic scale for people to grow at home. And if you do have any thoughts on their suitability for growing in the UK, then yeah, those would be welcome too. So Bill, maybe you can say something first about growing the red pea on a domestic scale.
On the domestic scale, it's a fairly easy pea to grow. You can actually start with the Sea Island pea, which might be your easiest form of the red pea to get from Anson Mills. You can buy some of the seed from them, and you would basically plant the seed, water it well. They need very little nitrogen in the soil because they're fixers. However, if you tend to plant these crops, particularly without doing some rotation, they won't do well over time. So even though these plants fix nitrogen, there are other nutrients they're getting from the ground. So if you do a small, simple rotation, they grow very well. You plant them, and all Daniel frost is over with. Within several weeks, you'll have your peas. And just make sure you rotate the crop, move to another location, let them dry. You can especially let them dry in the shell, and then shell them out, or you could eat them fresh.
Fantastic.
They have a nice woodsy, nutty taste.
Brilliant. It's very tempting to do. I would imagine it would be quite a struggle to grow cowpeas in the UK. I don't know, Josiah knows more about the growing side than I do. So Josiah, what would you think about growing cowpeas in the UK?
I think if you had a polytunnel, you could probably do it. And Vinea beans, mung beans, azuki beans are grown in Germany and in parts of Europe, but they have a climatic difference to us. They have a continental climate where it's drier in the autumn and they're more likely to mature. So they're quite frost tender. So they'd be tricky to do outside, but if you had protection, you could grow them. Yes, it'd be fun to grow them.
It is amazing what you can do in a polytunnel.
One more thing. Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, of course, please do.
Yeah, the Sapelo pea or the Geechee pea is a field pea. It's not quite the same as a cow pea. Cow peas have very little salt tolerance, whereas the Geechee pea has high salt tolerance. You can grow them on the coastal areas, and they can deal with the spray that you get from the salt in the ocean without a problem. So if you're in an area where that's going to be where you have a lot of salt spray and the salinity is high, that's the pea you want to grow. Cow peas, they're not that salt tolerant.
Okay, brilliant. That's a really useful insight. Thomas, perhaps you can tell us about potential growing at home of the lentils and peas that you were talking about.
Yeah, growing at home, I think the Rättvik pea, that's actually how it survived. It survived in the gardens, in people's homes, because they liked the taste and the quality of it. And it's just a very long, old style pea that you need to support. But I think since the old varieties also have a somewhat uneven maturity, they're really good to do like this, because you can see what pods that are mature and so on, and when you should harvest a little bit. So for garden growing, I think the pea is excellent. Lentils are lower, thinner bushes, and they have very, very small pods with just 2 lentils, 2 seeds in them, and it's a little bit hard time to hand harvest these things to get a volume. So I don't know, maybe if you're enthusiastic and really want lentils grown in that way, you could do it, but I would say that it requires quite some space to get a little bit of a volume of lentils and a lot of hand harvest and work.
But it's good work, but yeah, it is hard.
And I don't know for British, Josiah and I actually know each other from some time back, and we have exchanged some seeds over the years, and Josiah can answer this better, but I do think that varieties and cultivars adapted to Swedish Nordic conditions and latitude should work really well in England and Scotland as well. I don't think that should be a problem. It's the Rättvik pea is used to a lot of sun. We have many sun hours, as you understand, with being high up. But Josiah, maybe you even remember trying out one of our varieties and how it worked. But I think it should work well.
Oh, I've gone all funny. Can you hear me?
We can hear you okay. Just interesting visuals.
Okay, I'll switch off for a bit. Yeah, so Thomas is right. When we at Hodmedods began looking at what might be grown here, how we might recover some of this pulse culture and agriculture, we looked at those higher latitude areas like Sweden, and that's why I came over to see you back in whenever it was, 2014 or 15. And those higher light levels mean that some of those pulses can be grown quite north into Scotland. And you have a maritime climate as well. So there's a lot of comparators. And so the things that you grow, we can grow broadly. So if I see something on your website, I think we could do that if they can do that.
Yeah.
I think for home gardeners, the thing that's really exciting, the things that we do really struggle with, and that is the phaseolus, the common beans, and the runner beans, Phaseolus vulgaris and Phaseolus coccineus, which you will be growing to eat green. But at the end of the year, when they start to mature and become leathery and hard, and you don't want to eat them green in the kitchen anymore, just leave them on the bush. They will dry out naturally. And then at the end of the year, you've got a delicious dry bean, which will be saved through the winter. And I think that's a really quick and easy way to try a whole range of other things. I think people are very nervous about, for example, runner beans, eating the seeds. They're fine. In fact, they are some of the most delicious beans in the world, runner beans. They are absolutely amazing, creamy beans. Lentils are way too difficult because of the low yield. We did an experiment with a group called Garden Organic in England, where they were a members experiment. So we gave lentils out to hundreds of people to grow meter square plots to look at the viability of growing lentils. Got some really useful data for us about planting times and maturation at different latitudes. But I think the conclusion from the members is this is not a garden plant because of the effort that has to go into threshing the seeds out and harvesting.
Excellent. We've had a question. We've had several more questions, in fact, coming in about growing beans, and one asking about advice on a book. And I'll just chip in and recommend. There's a fantastic book called Growing Beans by Susan Young, which is a really good, accessible, and inspiring guide to growing not just beans but all pulses. Often we call pulses in general beans. So Growing Beans, I would recommend, by Susan Young. We're running short on time, but maybe just throwing another question. Well, pulling a few questions together. We've got a question about pulse flowers, and we've got questions about sprouted pulses. So I'll just invite any of our panelists who have anything to say on different ways that beans and pulses can be sort of processed or sprouted, and how that affects how we can eat them. Are any of you inspired to chip in on that? Josiah, I know you'll have something to say on this.
So, I mean, again, in the UK, because we've lost our culture around pulses, we just think of them as a thing you buy in a can in the supermarket. Maybe you buy it dry, but mostly you buy it in a can. And there are so many, and the rest of the world does so many amazing things. Fermentation, flours that you can put into bread, up to quite high percentages, 15, 20%. Tempeh, the misos, there's so much you can do. And again, that has blossomed over the last 10 years in the UK. I'd be interested to know what's happened in other parts of the world. But I think thinking of pulses and thinking of the ways that you can process them after harvest that make them nutritionally more bioavailable and change their flavors and mean you can use them even more and in even more recipes.
Brilliant. And Thomas, we're running very short on time, but any brief comment on different ways pulses are used in Sweden?
It's just like what Josiah says, and I think what he says about the bioavailability of the nutrition in pulses is going to be a key thing, especially here in Sweden. The discussion on healthy plant-based food, as plant-based food is increasing in interest, is really something that has become a hot topic, and a few studies has shown effects on high-processed plant-based food and how it hardly could be called food. And I think that's what we're going to see in the near future. So I would like to encourage all the people that are listening to ask for the market to bring forth clean label products with real good råvara in it, real good crops in it, whole low processed crops and healthy good food.
Yeah, good whole foods. We
yeah.
call them. But Bill, very briefly, are the red peas used in different ways?
They are. You have a lot, as I said before, you have a lot of people using them even in misos. They're also used a lot the way the Asians will do. They'll take the peas, they'll marinate them in sugar or syrup, and they're using it in desserts. And again, hummus is, that's changing so much. Instead of using the chickpeas, a lot of times the red peas are used in hummus. A lot of the restaurants and places like that.
Brilliant. Well, our time is pretty much up. So I'm going to just draw things to a close by thanking all three of our panelists. It's been, for me, an inspiring session to hear more about these pulses, even the ones that I'm familiar with on a day-to-day basis. But it's always great to talk about pulses and to hear more about pulses. So thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Josiah. Thanks to Dan for his amazing book and initiating this day of inspiration and food for thought, and raising the profile of not just pulses and their diversity, which we urgently need to help to save by eating more of them, but all the other foods as well that are being covered in the other sessions. And I'll just close by urging everyone listening to try pulses wherever you go, wherever you travel. There will be distinctive and different pulses available. Do try them, try eating them, hold on to a few, put them in your pocket, bring them home, try sowing them, growing them, and yeah, most importantly of all, eat more pulses. So thanks very much, and
thank you, Nick.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks.